Chris Peterson of the University of Michigan. Many of you know the name, pioneer in positive psychology, that branch of happiness research. Was always asked to speak by crowds after an end of academic presentations, popular presentations. Someone first question would be, Chris, tell me in one sentence, what is happiness? He always had the same answer. Other people matter. Relationships. Based upon what I've seen yesterday, today, the hallway conversations, the dinner conversations, the movement, I think I see a lot of relationships being strengthened and formed here. So by Chris's definition, I think this is a very happy conference. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful presenters today. First up is, we'll follow the same format as yesterday, 20 minutes each for the presenters. I may ask an orienting question or two afterwards, but I doubt it. I'm sure you'll be bursting at the seams. I'll try to steer the conversation as best I can. So first up, Sandy, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. So I'd like to give a little bit of background to this particular project. For a number of years, Art Goldsmith and I have been pursuing the examination of the impact of exposure to unemployment on people's psychological and emotional well-being. And then in fairly near time, Tim Diette and Darrick Hamilton joined us in trying to examine the effects of severe traumas that might be incurred during an individual's youth on psychological and emotional well-being. And we have a paper that's forthcoming in the Social Science Quarterly that has the disturbing title of Stalking, Does It Leave a Psychological Footprint? And it examines early exposure to the phenomenon of stalking, which is a very gendered form of abuse in the sense that a heavily disproportionate number of women are subjected to the trauma of stalking. And we try to examine whether or not later in life there appears to be an effect on their mental health. And as you might anticipate, there is evidence that that is the case. I think we're also interested in examining in the near future the question of whether or not exposure to these traumas actually has an impact on individuals' economic outcomes. So whether or not there's an effect on their patterns of employment, on the wages that they earn, that's perhaps detectable from these types of survey data that we're accustomed to using. But in this particular paper, we decided we would try to address whether or not exposure to a variety of traumas might have an influence on individuals' self-reported happiness. And so that's the connection to this particular conference. I remain a bit agnostic about whether or not self-reported happiness or subjective well-being, which was the subject yesterday, particularly I think, Dan, you introduced this in the first presentation, of whether or not this should be an object of public policy interest and whether or not we should shape public policy on the basis of people's subjective happiness or self-reported happiness. But I'm going to leave that on the floor, and there are going to be some puzzles that might emerge in our conversation here, which might indicate why I'm somewhat agnostic about this at this point. Our study is going to focus on 4 forms of victimization: sexual assault, stalking, direct exposure to violence in the home or the observation of somebody else in your home being subjected to violence, and exposure to violence in your community. And as will become apparent later, there are gender differences in the exposure to these different categories of trauma. So we're motivated in part by the recognition that there's a small piece of evidence or a small set of studies that indicate that traumatic victimization during childhood can have an adverse effect on human well-being later in life. So you're subjected to maltreatment as a youth, and this could be linked to poorer mental health as an adult. This particularly is evident in our study on the impact of stalking. Now, of course, mental health and happiness are not identical concepts necessarily. I presume it's possible for somebody who might be diagnosed as being clinically mentally ill in some fashion to self-report that they are quite happy. So our focus here is on happiness. It's not on any kind of clinical diagnosis or near clinical diagnosis of psychological health. So, in standard fashion, although this kind of decomposition or dichotomy is being subjected to somewhat withering criticism nowadays, we take the position that there's this set point theory of happiness where people typically have a particular degree of sensation about their happiness that's associated with their individual personality. After some major life event, there could be a temporary change in that happiness level, and the question becomes whether or not individuals gravitate back to that set point and how rapidly they might gravitate back to that set point. So we're suggesting that the trauma may lead people to be dislodged from that set point, and do they ever really get back to the set point? Don't know. We can't directly investigate this because we don't have a longitudinal panel. We don't have the capacity to actually examine what the impact of the trauma was at the point in which it occurred on the individual's self-reported happiness. So this is going to be implicit, and I'm not certain that we're really going to resolve whether or not the set point approach to happiness is valid, but that's kind of underlying the way in which we're thinking about this. Okay. So why is this potentially relevant at all? Well, I think that there are two major reasons that we offer, and they're both associated with health outcomes. Physical health and mental health outcomes might be strongly connected to self-reported happiness, although they are not identical concepts. In fact, I think numerous researchers have documented that there's a strong association between self-reported measures of happiness and health, although, of course, there's the question of which way causation is running. If you're looking at these two things, and they could indeed be running in both directions. But also, happiness measures are somewhat highly correlated with more conventional or material-oriented measures of well-being, such as consumption, income, and wealth. Particularly, and we'll come back to this with greater emphasis in a moment, particularly if it's relative levels of consumption, income, and wealth with respect to some pertinent comparison group. And what the pertinent comparison group is going to be left up in the air, but we'll come back to that also. So the only paper that we could find that has attempted to link traumatic victimization early in life and happiness is a paper by Royce et al. That was published in 1991. It examined 604 people in Kentucky. It compared the mean levels of life satisfaction between those who reported abuse as a child and those who, well, we say here avoided abuse, but those who don't report being subjected to forms of abuse. The difficulty with this study is it's essentially a bivariate analysis, and there's absolutely no controls for any other factors that might influence happiness outcomes. And now, we may be wrong. There may be other studies, and so if people are aware of them, please do share that with me. Okay, so the data that we use is the National Comorbidity Survey replication, carried out between February 2001 and April 2003. With approximately 5,600 observations in the sample. It's nationally representative, and it collects data in a life event format. so that individuals actually report the age at which they were subjected to a particular type of event. Okay. There are 3,232 females in the sample, 2,339 males, and the forms of traumatic victimization fall into the 4 categories that I mentioned earlier. So with respect to measuring happiness, and there may be some limitations here in terms of how we think about the ways in which people report happiness, but here's the question that we used. In the past 30 days, how often did you feel happy? All of the time, most of the time, some of the time, little or none of the time. We converted this to a binary measure so that a person who reports being happy most or all of the time was placed in the happy category, and then individuals who reported the 3 other types of conditions of happiness were placed in the unhappy category. And so if you look at the gender distribution of these responses based upon the binary classification, slightly over half of the women who responded could be classified as happy, and about 60% of the males could be classified as happy. So there is a significant portion of the sample that falls into the unhappy category, although, admittedly, we're not making any significant distinction and gradation between some, little, or none. Okay. Now, this is a concern that was of greater interest to me, and I kind of forced the team to try to examine this. I'm very taken by the research that started with Richard Easterlin's claims that human happiness is driven more by relative position than absolute position, particularly with respect to material well-being. And so I propose that we try to take into account some measure that would give us some information about the social comparison or the relative status of the individual, at least how the individual perceived their comparative position. One might want to take into account any number of groups that might be the relevant comparison groups. And there also could be the question of whether or not an individual belongs to a particular racial, ethnic, or social group and is making the comparison between their position vis-a-vis other members of their own group, or they're making the comparison with the other group, the out group. And so it could be a within group or a without group comparison that becomes relevant. That's not anything that we were able to tackle directly with this type of sample, not in terms of the responses to the questions that were asked, but there was a question that asked respondents to report their standing now relative to people in their community. Okay. So that's what we ultimately used, and we trichotomized the responses here. So we place people in the low level if they said that their status was 1 to 5 on a scale of 10. We placed them in the middle if it was 6 to 7 on a scale of 10, and we placed them in the high group if it was 8 to 10 on this same scale. And here you can see the distribution by gender of the responses. Roughly consistent with the way in which people think about class position in the United States, because I guess everybody thinks they're middle class, right? Okay. You can see that both for males and females, over 60% fall into this range of placing themselves at 0.6 or higher. Okay. But there's still, close to 30% of each of the gender groups that fall into the lower category. Okay, so here's how here's how the evidence is generated on self-reported sexual assault. So it's forced intercourse, forced penetration, or someone touching you inappropriately. Okay. Stalking, someone followed you or kept track of your activities in a way that made you feel you were in serious danger. Home violence, Were you ever badly beaten up by your parents or the people who raised you? Did you ever witness serious physical fights at home, like when your father beat up your mother? Okay, so the question is it's a pretty charged question. The General Social Survey folks would never allow a question like that to be put on the survey, but it was in this one. And then community violence. Were you beaten by anyone other than your parents? Were you mugged, held up, or threatened with a weapon? Okay. So here's the distribution by gender, again, of these various forms of trauma that get reported in the sample. And you can see that with respect to sexual assault, it's disproportionately weighted towards women who get exposed to sexual assault or who report it. And community violence is disproportionately weighted toward men. Home violence is fairly equal, although I'm not certain about the separation between the two types of home violence, whether the individual was subjected to being beaten themselves or whether they observed somebody else being beaten in the home. Okay. Here's the distribution of age of first instance of traumatization by gender. You can see that we have a significant share of the sample that gets exposed to these traumas before the age of 17. Okay, but again, with the males, community violence is occurring in large share of the sample, both before 17 and after 17, although I'm not sure once you get past the mid-20s whether or not there's the same degree of exposure to community violence. Okay. And now here is the possibility of comorbidity of trauma. So here's cases where, here we're identifying cases where individuals have been subjected to multiple types of traumas. And so, for example, if we look at this particular cell, these are individuals who were subjected both to sexual assault and stalking. And out of the individuals who had been exposed to any type of sexual trauma, 57% who reported being subjected to stalking also reported being subjected to sexual assault. That's fairly substantial, I think. Okay. That was for the females. This is for the males. So again, with the males, it's community violence that's carrying the heavy weight again. Okay. Happiness status by exposure to these various kinds of traumas for females and males. So you can see just in terms of this kind of bivariate comparison, once again, the categories where there's the heaviest exposure by gender seems to be associated with the highest degree of reported unhappiness. So you can see the males down here unhappy, the females unhappy who've been exposed to sexual assault. Okay. So we used a probit analysis to determine the impact of the four forms of these traumatic victimizations. And we're just going to report, I'm just going to report in the slideshow the marginal effects. And we took into account, the usual array of suspects. Because the sample is actually fairly large, it was possible to do a virtual kitchen sink regression in terms of things that we control for, including what state individuals were from, because maybe people are happier in some states than others. Well, actually, there was no significant effect associated with being in any particular state. So anyway, one of the difficulties that I would appreciate some advice about is what we might do about the fact that some of the controls have the characteristics of being endogenous, and we have not really identified a set of instruments that we think are satisfactory yet to try to control or take into account that kind of simultaneity. Okay. So the estimated association of traumatic victimization ever having occurred and being happy today. So there doesn't seem to be a statistically significant effect of exposure to stalking on contemporary reported happiness. Okay? I mean, the coefficient effects are negative in measure, but they are not statistically significant. Community violence for females does not appear to be statistically significant. But again, this may also be associated with a comparatively lower degree of exposure to community violence on the part of women. There's some evidence that black mothers in low-income communities are far more inclined to keep their daughters at home than their sons. And so the daughters might get exposed to less of the community violence. Okay. However, home violence and sexual assault do have strong adverse effects on self-reported happiness today. The other thing that I wanted to report is our findings about social standing influence on happiness. And in this particular context, we use the high group as the omitted group, so that these effects on happiness are associated with comparisons against the highest group. And you can see that being in the lowest group, or reporting that you're in the lowest group in your community, has the most negative effect on happiness that's reported. Being in the middle group has a negative effect, but clearly, the comparatively happier group is the group that has the highest status. And so is traumatic victimization linked to happiness later in life? Well, I suspect it's not a big surprise that the answer is yes, generally. But there is at least this one category, stalking, which doesn't seem to be associated with any significant long-term effects on happiness. And male victims of community violence also are less inclined to be happy. One last observation I'll make is that it looks like for women, neither race, ethnicity, or national origin have any kind of effect on self-reported happiness. But for males, there appears to be a positive effect associated with being black. Okay? So there seems to be this kind of happiness boost associated with being a black male, which is kind of consistent with an observation that I've made. And I want full attribution for this one. It's fun to be black, but it sure ain't easy. Okay. So, okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandy. Next up, we'll just, if we can hold our questions till they're both done. Do you have a burning one right now, George? You look like you might. My standard for burning pretty low.
How can I
Okay, we need
next?
technical.
Don't tell me yes.
Yeah, we had, right. Yeah, it's not really getting to it.
It's very small. That's
Small.
this. Yeah.
That's this. Which one is it?
It's this one. Here. No, not this. This. No. This. Okay. Yeah. That should be this. Yeah. Yeah. And this is probably try to click this. Honey. Yeah. It seems.
Mercury. There you go.
No, but then all of a sudden it changes. Okay.
You just got to click on the tab with your name on it.
There you go.
Hit F5. Okay, right. Okay, good.
All right, thank you.
That will not be deducted from your time.
Okay, so I'll try to be a
The
bit.
happy company, right?
All right. Okay. So thanks for your invitation. Really, really appreciating this workshop. This is really an exploration. We call it this talk exploration because this is what it is. We are pretty new to the world of genetic, and we are very happy to learn and to get your comments, advice, remarks, and all sorts of things. So let's start from scratch, okay? Using a random sample, we found people know, it's well known, that, okay, an interesting question, okay, is whether individuals are happier the richer they become, or in aggregate, in a country, the richer is the country, the more people are happy, okay? That's a very classical question in this literature, and probably unresolved yet. Generally speaking, use a normal regression. You put on the left-hand side some sort of measure of well-being, self-reported well-being, and on the right-hand side, things like obviously age and gender, and they're usually suspect, just to rephrase. And then you put income. Generally speaking, you observe an increasing, not very much increasing, but increasing a concave relationship. Although there is some argument also on that things. Okay, this is very much the beginning. However, the more people put control, the more people put variable, the more they realize something important. A big portion of happiness is unexplained. It's dark matter. If we can where is coming from? There are some countries that are just happier than others. It's difficult. People have added variables, control, interesting assumption, more or less verified by data, but there is still this huge portion of variance on happiness that you cannot really explain. And the big puzzle is Denmark. Denmark became very famous because of this, probably, because they are the happiest country in the world, and it's difficult to find out why they fare so well in almost every happiness rank. Obviously, after controlling for many things like public good provision, obviously income, all sorts of things, you still see Denmark, the position of Denmark, quite unexplained by data. So what is that? We explore, I want to use this stress on this explore, okay, a possible solution. Could some countries have a genetic advantage in happiness? Okay? Obviously, you're skeptical. I can see some eyebrow. I can see you. I don't know. You're not escaping that. We are skeptical too, in the sense we are exploring these things. This is a strange and arguably implausible idea. But I will present some evidence consistent with the idea of genetically happiness. Okay? This is what I will try to do. I will do that, and then we'll discuss how we are really spotting a real pattern, or we are just. One kind of evidence is based on the idea that Denmark is taken as the base case. And then we calculate the genetic distance of people living in Denmark from all other countries for which the data are available, which are 130 other countries. Let's define term. Now is the moment of defining term before I will show you the correlations. I will use a data on a variable called name measure of genetic distance on neutral genes. This is the two important words, name measure genetic distance, and neutral genes. This is the name distance. Now it's look at the first two, at the equation in the first two, row. X represent the percentage of a specific form of gene, polymorphism of gene allele present on that population, and Y is the same allele present on the other population. So we are comparing population X and population Y. Okay? So we take the X represent frequency. The frequency of that allele, the specific allele, population X, and the frequency of that specific allele in population Y. Now, this index looks complicated, but it essentially does something very simple. The more similar they are, X and Y, the more they tend, the I here tend to 1. Therefore, the logarithm tend to 0. When they are identical, this is 1, distance is 0. The more are distant, the more that things become smaller and smaller, and the more the logarithmic tend to infinity. Okay? So essentially, this D is something which is small if populations are genetically very similar, big if a population are genetically very distant. Okay? That's all. That's all what you have to say.
Can you tell me what a neutral gene is?
Yes, that's the second point. Thanks for this question. Right. I can see that you are very. Yeah, I'm very pleased that you haven't lost you. This neutral gene has been the concept neutral gene has been put forward by an Italian geneticist, Cavalli Sforza, Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, now emeritus at Stanford University. Now, that's what he selected genes that were not the result of natural selection. I mean, allegedly not. Genes that determine things are not that important for the survival of the species. An example is the blood, the frequent, the A, B, or O blood, the kind of blood you have. Okay, that's not. It's a neutral thing. It's a neutral marker. Now, why is it important? This. It's very important because if those genes affect our performances, there is a big problem. There might be a problem of endogeneity, omitted variable. Perhaps people are happier because, I don't know, they are more clever. Okay, the fact that using so-called neutral genes can smooth a bit this problem, okay? So generally, the syntheses are computed on 120 alleles. What Cavalli Sforza did was to select, to go on all 50 populations.
But how do you know that they are neutral?
It's Cavalli Sforza, it's this book. I mean, clearly there are argument on that. Yeah.
But is it it's just by not finding anything that they affect, or is it something else?
I don't know, honestly.
Because if it's the first thing, the fact that you guys found something that they affect means they are no longer natural. Exactly.
Yes, they are just a marker. Okay, what geneticists use? Why they use these things? They use because they are markers of distance between two populations. That's a simple marker. It doesn't affect your performances. It's just show that two populations are far away.
It does affect the performance. It
No,
affects, for
not the-
example, happiness.
Happiness might not be a performance, but let's go back. Okay. Fine. Now, subjective well-being, we use we essentially use three main measures: struggling, thriving, and suffering. Why we use this measure? Because they are in the Gallup, and the Gallup has a big coverage in country-wise. They are based on country. Basically, they are based on the country ladder. Okay, present plus future country ladder. I'm not a particular fan of the country ladder, but the advantage of the Gallup is that it has a bigger coverage. obviously, we then check the consistency of our result with the typical average life satisfaction. Okay. Yes, I think I've told you everything. Show you the first feature. Here you see the log of the genetic distance from Denmark. Okay. Clearly, Denmark is not here because everything is in distance from Denmark. Here is one index of well-being. I put on the web all other indices. They are more or less similar. So I'm using struggling, but we could have used all the others. Now, you see, here is Sweden, the Netherlands, Norway. Here as Austria, Great Britain, Jamaica, so on. Finland is a bit an oddity here. Right? Yeah. Okay. Now, clearly, you're all clever people and you know that the fact that you are genetically similar to Denmark might mean everything and nothing. Might mean just that you are just closer, physically closer to Denmark. Might mean that you have your wealth is similar to Denmark. Might mean that your culture is similar to the culture. So there are a lot of omitted variables.
Well, on that point, is there, just as a smell test, I mean, is there a historical explanation for why the Czech Republic is so close and Finland so far away?
Yes.
You shall,
Yeah,
we can
Finland is totally
yeah.
different ethnically and linguistically.
Look, I think it's a long discussion. Maybe we can.
I just want to know, I mean, if someone sees that as plausible, if the answer is yes, I'm happy. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's plausible. Yeah, it's plausible.
So how does this work with countries that have groups that are populations that are heterogeneous?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
where is
the-
Australia?
Perfect.
We're gonna give him 10 more minutes, okay, so finish his presentation, and then we'll
This
dive
index
into
is the initial neutral genes of Cavalli-Sforza were based on homogeneous population. These data have been aggregated country-wise using percentage weighted. The aggregation is weighted for the ethnic population. Okay, so it's taken into account the fact in the United States, for example, it doesn't make any sense to talk about Then you aggregate the different population of the United States with the frequencies. Okay.
But you do have to have some priors about who the different populations are.
There are data
I
on
mean, that's not
genetics.
driven by genetics in and of itself, is it?
There are data on genetic, ethnic
Okay,
fractional.
we'll come back to this.
On
But,
yeah.
but ultimately, you presumably are arguing that there's a genetic basis for race classification.
Maybe it's a difficult question. I want to avoid to generate diplomatic problems, so I'll come later.
Eugenio, 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes.
Get out the ideas and then we'll, then we'll free for all. Dedicated by
Yeah,
Diette.
I will try to avoid.
Get to the talk here.
Yeah, so what we did essentially is try our best to control for all possible things that you can control. So we had difference in GDP from Denmark, geographic distance and continent Denmark, dummies, cultural distance, and I'm very happy to hear from you something. Okay, you can just you didn't include this. I will be very happy to take it on board. And I will thank you at the end of the paper, Okay. Second kind of evidence, this is a bit more, I'm not pushing this very much because as I discussed already with Dan, geneticists are starting to be very skeptical about the possibility that one single gene can determine something, okay? The effect of each single gene is quite tiny. So, but anyway, we have some data, few data on this famous polymorphism, the 5-HTT-LRP, which is essentially a gene that determines the production of serotonin. Serotonin is a substance that when it's very low, we tend to be depressed, okay? So it's used to be considered the gene of the happiness. Obviously, recently, geneticists, they got very upset about this definition, and there are a lot of studies showing that this doesn't have an effect. Some studies show that there is a little effect. Anyway, I'll present you the data. You will then, you will cast your judgment, make your judgment. It's just there. Okay. To our surprise, Denmark has the most advantageous level of the serotonin transporter gene. This is interesting. I use this country here. There are only 30 data, but I picked up these countries because they are the so-called Western and Western offshoots. So there are countries which are politically, culturally, and genetically similar. And you can see what Denmark, which is the best, happiest country in the world, and I don't want to tell you which one is the last one. I'm a bit ashamed of that. But anyway, that's the picture, okay? This is the percentage of people with disability. You know, I married a Finn, okay, to make my kids a bit happier. It's true. My wife is Finnish, so in a way we are a bit in Germany or somehow. Anyway, let me go a bit further, if I can. Okay. Also, the cross-country regression also works better than anyone would have expected with this specific gene. And we added control and so on. I'll show you something later. Okay. Might our evidence be just an example of the known tendency to be false positive?
You got a citation for that?
Andrew Oswald. Okay. Now, let me show a bit of I've said everything I wanted to say. Now I want to show you a bit of numbers, okay? So we have a better base to discuss. Here, the first one is this genetic distance from Denmark. You can see it's very strongly related to this struggling index, but it's related to all sorts of index of well-being you can find. This even after controlling for GDP differences from Denmark to the whole country you are comparing, geographic distance from country, and for continent dummies, okay? Fine. I added something else, which I think I'm quite surprised too. Here I added everything I could think of cultural similarity. What defines? Okay, first of all, it's clearly there are reasons to think that culture and genetic endowment are correlated. Why? Because you pass your genes to your kids as much as you pass your culture, okay? So the economists nowadays tend to consider two things very much linked, culture and genetics. Now, I try to put in everything I can think could define the culture of a country, in terms of distance, obviously, from Denmark, okay?
Why do Protestants struggle so much more than Catholics? I would have thought it was the other way around.
This is the difference between Protestant in Denmark and Protestant elsewhere. So you have to read in terms of distance, okay? So the less Protestant, because since in Denmark everybody's Protestant, the less Protestant you've got, the more you have, okay? Just the opposite. Don't read this in terms of, these are distances, okay? These are distance from Denmark. So don't interpret the coefficients. Just important to say something. When you control for religion, nothing happens. If anything, the coefficient seems to become bigger. I added something which I'm very proud, actually, is this linguistic distance. There is an index of linguistic distance from James Ferron, who was very nice to send it to me, and it has got no effect. And here, I added what is nowadays considered culture, by management scientist, economist, which is the Hofstede indices, the dimension of culture. We have individualism, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity, always in difference from Denmark. Here the data become much smaller, 60, but you see the significance doesn't look to be affected, okay? So I try to put everything, we try to put everything we could think of, okay? Because we are skeptical ourselves, clearly, okay? We try really to disprove these things. But the more we have evidence, the more we start to get convinced that perhaps we spotted a real path. Now, we horse raced our famous happiness gene with the genetic endowment. If this is really the happiness gene, and honestly, you know, it's a big, big if, okay? This should win. It should be more significant than the general one, because here are everything. This is the one specific. And it looks like it's going on the direction we want it to go. But again, I'm take this with really a grain of salt, because there is big skepticism nowadays among geneticists that this famous 5-HTTR effectively has an effect on it. So across world measure of human well-being are correlated with genes and GDP. Correlated, not saying anything about causality, but this at least is a correlation. Although much more research will be needed, there is, to our surprise, some reason to believe that a nation like Denmark has a genetic advantage on happiness. And this is all.
Thank you, Eugenio. Sandy will come down too. I was worried on a Friday morning and it'd become a dead, quiet crowd and I wouldn't be able to prompt conversation. I'm just going to leave the room and come back. And I think we're fine. Sandy, please. Two very interesting, provocative, great presentations. I'm going to fool you. I'm going to use my prerogative as chair and start the first question with Sandy, not Eugenio. Sandy, there's a robust literature on resilience. I counted, I believe, 104 peer-reviewed published studies in 2012 alone on various aspects of resilience. To what account, the ability to bounce back from trauma, or more conversely, thrive after trauma? Did you account for any traits, dispositions, or look into how does resilience play into your results, or going forward, how would you look at that?
So there's a set of variables that we wanted to try to take into account that were presumably associated with buffers. But it's interesting. I think that none of them proved to be statistically significant. So I think that the weight really falls on the nature of the trauma rather than on the individual's characteristics. So as I pointed out, there doesn't appear to be a statistically significant effect on current self-reported happiness in this sample for individuals who were subjected to stalking, whether male or female. But on the other hand, in the other categories of trauma, there does appear to be an effect, and it's a particularly strong effect for males who were exposed to community violence and for females who were exposed to sexual assault. So it's not really evident that there are any significant insulating characteristics for the individual that inhibits the damage to their happiness. But that the more important characteristic or feature is the nature of the trauma itself. And then, of course, what I didn't report was the even more pronounced effects that were associated with being exposed to multiple traumas.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I actually just wanted to follow up directly on that and suggest that you might draw some wisdom from the second paper on the role of serotonin reuptake on happiness, which is to say that PTSD is associated strongly as an epigenetic effect on serotonin reuptake. So we have genetic gene genes that predispose us to serotonin reuptake problems, but there can also be epigenetic effects. And all of the traumas you're talking about are closely associated with PTSD. So that just might be an underlying.
So they trigger trait expression.
Yeah, it might, but, well, it triggers protein suppression.
Yeah.
But it might provide you with a physiological rationale for the phenomenon you observe.
Peter?
This is actually directly connected with that, because it relates to the two papers in this phenomenon of genetic regulation. So one reason people are skeptical about the depression gene is that so much of the role of genes is determined by regulation rather than the code. And Finland sits over there with a very high rating in subjective well-being, but genetically not close to Denmark and Sweden. What is early childhood like in Finland versus Sweden, Denmark, and Norway? It might be that if we looked at early childhood, we would find that there are similarities in whether the children are raised in a similar way, whether they early on have exposure to well-protected, assured group setting with other children. So it seems that one kind of difference that might explain why Finland and those other countries could behave so similarly, despite the genetic distance, would be the gene expression is going on, and that early on, children in Denmark and Finland get rather similar dispositions.
Do you want to take the question or have?
I saw you raised your.
Yeah, but I just
Oh,
want
do you
to
want to
answer the question first.
Oh, was it?
I think it's directed at Eugenio, right?
Well,
Yeah.
but but it was, I mean, it was just used, I meant to be saying that I found your paper interesting precisely for that.
Because of the focus on the trauma in
On the way in which
during
early
the young
experience,
years.
yeah, can change
A trajectory.
lifetime subjective well-being
Yeah,
in a non-transient way.
yeah. John?
My question kind of just takes maybe part of this a little bit. What, Sandy, in your paper, it struck me that I would have been interested to hear if there's a correlation between trauma and perception of status, and whether the causal chain
Good question.
goes through that, and if you would.
I don't know
in that
the answer.
direction, what effect is left.
Yeah, that's definitely worth examining. Yeah. But that's an issue that's associated with potential circularity in the model. And I mentioned at one point that we're thinking that there's some potential for things to be endogenous in the model, and so we have to figure out a way to best take that into account. But that's a very, very, very important point.
This is a great study, and it's certainly, as a matter of sort of folk psychology, it's intuitive that trauma of various kinds in childhood will cause adult unhappiness. But, I mean, there's one obvious confound. It's not really clear how you would test for it, which is that less happy people remember trauma. Right? I mean, that is either less happy you are, for whatever independent reason, the more likely you are to remember trauma of various kinds. There's big literature on suppressed trauma and memory of trauma. I mean, is there any way to control for that?
No, because we don't have any independent information about what individuals were actually exposed to beyond what they self-report.
Right.
So I don't think.
I mean,
there's
so
a way
I suppose you could get sort of family member reports about trauma. That'd be one way to do it.
Well, if you had a different study,
Right.
yeah, and started your own study, but yeah.
Walter,
But not with the database that we're using.
I had another kind of methodological question, because it wasn't clear to me, but you were asking all these different questions on the same questionnaire, right?
Well, not us personally, but yeah,
But
the
they were,
comorbidity
right.
study does.
So I'm just
yeah.
wondering whether, remembering the trauma would make them report less happiness.
Okay, so this is really the question about the sequence in which the questions are
Right.
asked.
Were they counterbalanced?
No, I think that the happiness question precedes the questions about whether or not you were exposed to trauma, but that's very important, because if the happiness question comes after, then obviously there's the
seemed to me
potential for the triggers about memory of these traumas to affect whether or not people are reporting how happy they've felt over the past 30 days.
It would also affect, for example, kind of where you report your status in the community. If you're reminded of your trauma and how unhappy you are, and then somebody says, "Where are you in the community?" you might be more likely to put it low, and then it's going to look like there's an
because,
effect, but
because
it's
the-
actually
because
just
your
a,
community status question, yeah, that's right, because the community status
Yeah.
question doesn't indicate what is it about your status that you're
Right.
comparing? So maybe you do start to think, well, am I happier than other folks? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
possible. It's
Yeah.
possible, yeah.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. My problem, my feeling is that we need to have a better control for family origin, in the sense that, I mean, people living in bad area or very poor.
We have all kinds of controls for that. We
I
do.
noticed, but okay, nowadays economists are very suspicious about controlling. That's why I'm suspicious myself about my research. But I'm just
Yeah.
going on. Did you check if you have any family you can do a family fixed effect? So you have in the survey, do you have people that belong to the same household?
I don't know.
Because then you can put the family fixed effect.
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't
Clear
think.
a lot of problems.
They probably, maybe in the raw data, there's some coding for that, but that's not available to the researchers, and I presume for confidentiality reasons. Yeah, so I can't answer, I can't answer,
But that would
who
be-
in the sample
that would be a real-
might be from exactly the same family.
Yeah.
And then you're saying there could be a cross-check on the reports of exposure to various kinds of trauma, right?
Yeah, that will, the family
Yeah.
fixed effect will take care of a lot of omitted variables.
We can't do that with this data set.
I'm gonna go in order here. George?
Uh,
And then Darrick.
I get on methodology, but mostly regarding the estimation. I noticed you did a probit model, right?
Yeah.
Merging. Well, initially you have a few happiness categories, just like a 4 scale.
Yeah.
Which seems to me that you.
I mean, we drove it to be binary, and,
By doing that, by imposing these restrictions on your model in a very small scale anyway, you even decrease further the variability of the response. So you're missing out information that could be valuable. And you could try another probit around the logic model and get the predicted probabilities for each outcome separately.
Okay.
Because you have too few variability within a 4 scale response anyway,
Yeah.
to then decrease it even further.
Or
to
even
that-
further.
to that binary.
Yeah.
Dan, you had your hand up a while ago.
Sandy, I was surprised with the community violence with males, and I was wondering if that was controlled, if you controlled for things like loneliness, social inclusion, like if what's really going on is that you're more likely to get beat up if you're not popular.
So there's not a direct measure for something like popularity, but there is measures of, for how frequently you interact with other people, and, they're kind of social network questions that we did take advantage of in the study. I'm not sure if that fully gets at what you're thinking about.
That's the neighborhood of my concern. I would just, for a happiness measure, I would think it'd be really helpful to use a broader spectrum, like a PANIS or DRM, something where you get negative affect in there. You might get a much stronger effect on happiness.
Yeah, but of course, one of the problems was that we were seeking a data set where we had a lot of detail about exposure to trauma. So, we may not, in a data set that had better measures of happiness, we may not also have the information that we're seeking about trauma. So, that's the trade-off, yeah.
Brock, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so two I guess, questions for Eugenio. One is, I guess a presumption of the paper is that by selecting neutral genes, you're saying, and trying to use neutral genes to explain happiness, I guess we're saying that happiness is not a contributor to genetic survival, correct? I mean, happy and unhappy people are equally as likely to survive.
Yeah, that's an assumption.
The other thing, and maybe that's true, maybe it explains a lot of unhappiness in the world, right?
Sorry, second?
It would explain a lot of unhappiness in the world. Although on the other hand, if that's wrong, then we would really be in an unhappy place. Or maybe a happy place. Maybe unhappiness is actually a contributor to survival. Who knows? But the other question is, so the paper. I'm thinking about the convenience. That Denmark is a very genetically homogeneous place. Maybe, of course, that's part of the story. We don't know. I wondered if it would be possible to, instead of looking at national data, you know, you take Denmark still as the ground zero, but if you could look at individual genetic data in a singular location instead of looking at national genetic frequencies. So, you know, whatever, you go to New York and you look at individuals there and look at the individual difference, genetic distance from Denmark. Because certainly what you're doing is it bias, the diverse countries are going to be pushed towards the middle and the homogeneous countries are going to be pushed towards the ends. Isn't that right?
I'm not sure, honestly. We can go back on that. Okay, here we have
I guess lots of people put
Sweden.
together.
Sweden, they're not
Maybe
that
against the middle.
homogeneous, let's see. Obviously, United States is pretty heterogeneous.
So Sweden and Denmark are actually not homogeneous. Finland is.
Yeah, Finland is strange.
Sweden, Denmark, Norway have all had enormous immigration over several generations. On some measures.
GB is pretty heterogeneous.
Is what?
GB is pretty heterogeneous.
Heterogeneous, yeah.
So I don't know, maybe not. But okay, what you are saying. Okay, I'll take the questions. I will answer to all of them on a row. Maybe I don't know what you prefer. Okay, I'll take it and okay.
Curious also about the genetic study. So a couple of points and a question. One is that, I mean, almost by definition, your measure of genetic relatedness, so if you use the Ney index or the College Force, any of those, you're measuring overall relatedness, which means you are, on the long term, measuring degree of interaction, human interaction. So
human interaction,
if it means anything, that is, if you're measuring distance, then you are measuring at a sort of the aggregate of a fine scale interactions among people in those groups, which means you're measuring cultural difference. I mean, this becomes a proxy for cultural interactions, personal interactions, every manner of interaction. So regardless of what you measure to control for cultural interaction, I would argue you basically can't do it. That is, if there's been a persistent effective genetic relatedness, you have shown that you have not controlled for the level of interaction that's reflected in genetic relatedness, and that there are interactions, individual interactions that are keeping groups separate, regardless of whether you control for the culture. So it seems to me that it's just mathematically not possible to control for the fine-scale cultural interactions separate from the genetic interrelatedness. So that would be, I mean, we debate it, but that would be what it seems to be. The other question on the 5-HTT-LPR is whether you got, if I understood, you got, these are sort of metadata that you got from other studies, and whether those were studies, whether the measures of 5-HTT-LPR frequencies were taken from studies that had found a relationship between allele frequency and some measure related, some psychological measure like depression or happiness, in which case you have to end up, I think, from that population, you have to end up with a skewed measure because all of your metadata come from studies that found an effect. And so the question would be, is it possible to even control for that level of effect inside your study?
Maybe start to answer a bit. Okay, I'll start with the idea of Finland and their advantage in terms of raising kids. I agree with you. And Nordic countries are very good on that. We also, in other regressions, we control for human development indicators. But yeah, it's true. It's true that Finland is a bit an oddity because although it's genetically different from the rest of Nordic country, it still fare very well. But not that well, you see? Not that well. It fares well, but not that well as Denmark and Sweden and Netherlands actually, which is that's the puzzle after all. Happiness survival, yes, good point. You're saying, I mean, if happiness helps survival in itself, which is probably a point that you were thinking, right? Yeah, yeah, good point. Yeah, guess I didn't think about that. Happiness can affect survival, therefore those genes are not neutral. I'm sure Cavallis Force will be happy to know that his his research is a bit flawed, but it's a good point. Honestly, I don't have really an answer to that. The only answer is that perhaps happiness doesn't affect that much the probability of survival. But
it's reproduction, not survival. Affect reproduction more than it affects survival.
Yeah.
Happiness.
Yeah. And survival on the offspring.
Yeah.
In this respect, that's true. But in this respect, I know some literature on extroversion, which is normally correlated with happiness, and why we are not at the end, all of us extremely extrovert. Some of us is introvert, someone, and then the answer is because extrovert might be better in spreading their genes, but might be much worse in taking care of their kids. That's the answer in this. So that means that happiness might have a double effect on that thing. Okay. Variance this is another tremendously interesting point. Variance might affect in itself happiness. I know there are data on genetic variance within countries, okay? So it could be an interesting control, perhaps, or maybe another paper. Another interesting point. But again, I don't know. This point of mathematical control is worrying. This is the most worrying point that you raise. I hope you are not right, honestly. Perhaps we can discuss about one-to-one, because I guess it will be difficult to understand each other given the point is pretty subtle. But I hope you are not right. HTTP studies. Yes, I think we took this. You were out. Okay. Yeah. I think that there is a huge possibility of a publication bias, because essentially we took from another paper the aggregate measure, but this paper used all the possible papers produced on HTTP to aggregate these indices. Now, the fact that this paper have been published means they found something, which means they are likely to be biased on this respect. Yes, we were aware a bit of this. Also, that's also the reason I don't want. You see, that the one on HTTP I use more as a kind of motivating, because it's there we started by eyeballing this data and noticed that they were. Just by looking at them, they were correlated by that. That's why I like to use this more in a way to start the discussion. But I'm very prudent when it's about the HTTPS, because I know it's a very, very sensitive point nowadays among geneticists. There is a harsh fight, Okay, I think I can.
Hold up, I don't. Maybe more to Kate. I don't really see why cultural distance and genetic distance are necessarily confounded. I mean, my guess is that if you looked at the genetic distance between people in, say, Albuquerque or Sacramento and people in Las Vegas, there's not going to be much difference. But culturally, in terms of what's permitted in Las Vegas as opposed to Albuquerque or Sacramento, it's quite different. And the explanation is just that there can be coordination effects, mutual expectations about what can go on in one place as opposed to another, which are part of culture. So now the question is how you measure that. But I mean, just as a matter of the underlying economy of culture, I don't see why necessarily the degree of cultural distance, in the full sense of what we understand by culture, has got to track genetic distance. There can be local cultures which have nothing to do with genetic distance.
If I could just quickly, I meant the other way around. You can have much bigger cultural differences than genetic, but if you've got genetic distance, you don't have fine scale enough interactions to eliminate cultural differences as the explanation. So cultural differences are a more powerful explanation.
But if you put them in the regression, they should take away the significance. That's our argument, you see. Now, I don't know if it's flawed, this argument, and honestly, I would be happy to talk to you about it. But you see here, no, this is not the right one. Here, let's forget the offset, because the offset, unfortunately, we only have 60 data. Now, if the genetic, the cultural distance was effective, was generating this correlation, okay? That was just a spurious correlation because the omitted variable is culture. When you put religious group, religious heritage, whatever you want to call, you should see that this coefficient will go down. I'm not saying it's become insignificant, but at least going down. Now, if anything, it looks like it's growing.
Well, they're not significantly different, the two coefficients. The confidence intervals overlap. Standard errors. So, I mean...
It's not getting smaller, right?
A test between the two coefficients...
It's not getting smaller, right? It's not getting smaller. Look, it's not getting smaller.
It's not statistically
No, I'm saying the magnitude is not getting smaller, okay? So that's what? It's not getting smaller, point. So this is it's not an opinion. It's getting bigger, if everything. Now you're saying it's not...
Stays unaffected, I would say.
Yeah, but it's not getting smaller, right?
I don't think we can say that. If the confidence intervals overlap, you don't know whether it's getting smaller or not.
Sorry, say again.
If the confidence intervals overlap, you can't say it's not getting smaller. You don't know whether it's getting smaller or not. That's what the confidence intervals overlap.
Yeah, but you can see the standard errors is getting smaller, standard error, right?
We have no evidence that it's getting smaller, but that doesn't mean it's not getting smaller.
It's not getting smaller.
We'll move on from that point.
We're talking about the measure, not talking about it.
You had your hand up or something.
Yeah, but this question is not related to any of these things. Can I ask a question slightly out of left field?
Yes, you may.
All right. I'm a historian, and I recently wrote a book about slavery practiced in Portuguese West Africa in the early 1900s on cocoa plantations. And what didn't get into that book was an essay that I'd given at a conference about happiness. The Portuguese, in responding to their critics, said, the workers on São Tomé and Príncipe are happier than our own peasants. And so the essay explores what that's supposed to mean. So these two papers are obviously a great interest to me as I try and figure out ways to think about this question of happiness. So my one question is it possible to do a data mining expedition on literary sources and historical sources to come up with a sense of how happy or unhappy the Portuguese were? And has anybody done a study on happiness, however defined, among enslaved populations? So these are questions not quite like this, but it's the reason I'm here.
So the closest thing that I'm aware of to the kind of issue you raise is the famous Fogel and Ingerman claim, which I think was drawn from left literature from the 1920s and 1930s, that the material status of enslaved blacks was better than the material status of landless whites in the sense. I think the slaveholders would have probably made that argument, but it may actually have been true in some sense. Okay. But in terms of the happiness argument, well, now, okay. So there's always been the happy darky image that was purveyed by the slaveholders, and especially the perpetrators of the lost cause concept. But then if you look at really much more careful historical research like Tavoya Glimph's book, Out of the House of Bondage, it's fairly clear that, if the slaveholders perceived happiness, it was primarily because there was a performance of happiness that was being displayed to them, not because people substantively felt that way. So yeah, I think there is literature that can be pursued to explore this, but I'm not so sure about the, in Cape Verde. Or São Tomé, okay, yeah.
The problem is that it's elites gazing upon workers in Portugal and Britain and São Tomé and Príncipe saying they're happy.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other part that interests me is the unhappiness of the Portuguese embedded in the statement that the workers on São Tomé and Príncipe are happier than our own peasants. And certainly Portuguese themselves, Portuguese scholars will say of themselves, the Portuguese are a sad people. And I think to myself, well, how do you prove that beyond
there are
one?
no Portuguese
Yeah, there are no Portuguese out there. I was,
It must be, maybe it's there in the class that you cannot see. Can you spot any point?
yeah. It needed to be Eugenio. We would have gotten the Portuguese.
Your question is.
Well, Brazil is there.
Brazil is not Portugal.
No, true. Everybody's happy in Brazil, right?
Apparently so.
I think Portugal is fairly low, actually.
If your question
It's true, it's true. It's as happy as you
Yeah,
are.
yeah, yeah.
It's
In this
obvious.
it's a little, I'm actually
So where's
wondering-
Italy, though? Because you all
Italy is pretty sad.
pretty sad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right about the milk.
It's because you don't have much serotonin, right?
That seems to be the case. I hope my daughters have taken this, the finish at it. Anyway, I just want to add something.
statutory obligation to bring this back.
Can I add up something on that question, because this is a very interesting point, and I don't see how my data can do, but I want to add something. Economists have used slavery very much as a way to identify the effect of slavery, clearly not on happiness, but on productivity, human capital. There is an extremely interesting experiment being carried by a guy called Daron Acemoglu and Melissa Dell. They, in Peru or Ecuador, I'm not sure, I don't remember very well. At some point there was a law that was obliging a group of people to be enslaved for a period of time to work. Now this line is very straight. People across this line, they were subject to this law, people that were, and then nowadays, if you go and
Regressive
look,
discontinuity.
discontinuity.
Yeah.
There is a clear discontinuity. Now, if you look at the people living behind this line and across the line, nowadays, the people who were subject to slavery have significantly lower level of human capital, for example. And I wouldn't be surprised if you also would spot any depression or effect on happiness. So I think it's a very interesting experiment, this one.
Jonathan, you had your hand up, or did you have a follow-up?
No.
Jonathan, you were next.
I do, but if someone over there wanted to jump in on this.
Oh, I just
point.
had a follow-up on kind of that point. I've done some work looking at the kind of dimension of well-being that respondents answer when you ask them an open-ended happiness question, depending on their kind of means or capabilities. And I'll talk a little bit about it when I give my paper, but just to give you one example of what we found in Afghanistan, where we did just a pilot study of well-being, we found that that on average people in Afghanistan, at least in our sample, scored higher than the world average on how often did you smile yesterday, which is just a positive affect, hedonic well-being question, and on open-ended, how happy are you with your life in general, a very open-ended question. But they scored much, much lower than the world average on the Gallup Cantrell ladder question, how does your life compare to the best possible life? It sort of frames, it's much more framed, and it's much more about capacities and agency and relative status. And then some other work we've done in Latin America finds that after having enough food to eat, the most important variables to the happiness of the poor are friends and family they can rely on at times of need, and the most important variables to the happiness of the rich. These are rough categories, above and below median income, are work and health. So you could assume that the rich are greedy jerks and they don't care about their friends, but what it really is that for the poor, friends and family are a safety net in the absence of other means, and for those with means, work and health are their agency to be able to do something with their lives. So there's just some evidence that people who are in very bad situations sort of adapt and focus on just probably coping skills, and if they have, naturally positive affect, that's going to come out. Versus, if they're in a situation that they can't change and they're spending their whole time thinking about how does my life compare to the best possible life, they're going to be miserable. And then last thing, we see a lot, when people are making changes, right, to sort of go from point A to point B, whether it's migrating to another country or just going up the income ladder by working very hard or, whatever it is, we see that process of change is usually an unhappy one, even though later on down the road, they may be happy in a different sense. But so there seems to be a lot of adaptation. And that seems to also kind of cross which well-being dimension people emphasize.
Thank you, Carol. Jonathan, you had your.
Yeah, I just had a thought for Sandy's paper about exposure, which exposures to trauma at what point in life might be driving the later results. And one addition, if it's not already in your work, is to look at exposures in utero. And so there are already some studies on exposures of the mother while pregnant to various traumas, then tracking long-term longitudinal panels to see what the effects are on the adolescent offspring or later. I know, for example, Janet Rich Edwards at Harvard Medical School has looked at exposure to racism and hormone spikes in the mothers to see if that correlates with later violent behavior by the adolescents or other things. So that I don't know if that would help in resolving some of the possible, for example, if the subject is misremembering, or if there are selection effects in what people remember as their trauma that are actually being driven by their current happiness or unhappiness, maybe the in utero exposure, because you're getting the answer about the trauma from a different person, from asking the mother instead of asking I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, I don't think we can actually do that with this particular data set, but it's an interesting suggestion. I mean, I guess the real issue, though, with the misremembering is whether or not we have any basis for believing that the responses involve systematic error. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, if it doesn't, then, so there's some people who are giving us incorrect answers. As long as that's not correlated in any consistent way with the individual's characteristics, then so be it. But
more general point
is
there
that
might actually be traumas
that occur earlier, that occur in utero. Yeah,
but also
and I simply don't think we can get at that with with this particular survey, but it is definitely worth investigating. Yeah.
Yeah, I was also going to mention this in utero research and also research on macaques, I believe, which find that early traumatic exposure have the effect that it has the macaques have a higher stress response to novel stimuli persistently. And so this would be different from a memory effect. And so you can see that kind of effect persisting as a result of early trauma, which again would be independent of memory of a traumatic event. Neutral, but.
Sandy, I'm interested in hearing about some of the things that you looked at that might attenuate. You said you looked at various buffers and none of them seem to have much beneficial effects. Coming from more of the psychology end of the spectrum, of literature that I might look to kind of attenuate some of these effects would be post-traumatic growth and generativity, both of which look at how people respond to early suffering in a way that helps them feel better about their lives moving forward. I don't know if you have questions that might answer that in your survey, but I'd love to hear more about kind of what you did look at.
Yeah, So there's a section of the paper where we say the victims of traumatic events who have greater resources may be better positioned to recover from maltreatment. Better socioeconomic status could foster better knowledge of how to go about trying to recover in terms of therapy and medication and access to the desirable help. Thus, it's possible that the adverse link of early life traumatic victimization on adult happiness may be mediated by socioeconomic position. To explore this hypothesis, we began by interacting mother's education level with each of the types of traumatic victimization without accounting for the timing of maltreatment. And we use this because mother's education is supposed to be highly correlated with the family's financial well-being. And then we interacted an alternative measure of socioeconomic status, the person's own level of educational attainment, with each of the 4 measures of traumatic victimization. And there was no evidence that these interaction terms were statistically significant, which is kind of the refuge of a regression scoundrel, but yeah, scoundrel. But those are the central things that we tried to look at as characteristics of socioeconomic characteristics. But we also had some controls for the types of factors that Dan had mentioned, which was the degree of interaction with other members of your community or the frequency of interaction, so that, trying to get at the question of whether or not the individual is more or less socially isolated. But that wasn't statistically significant either. So, yeah, I mean, there may be some other things we could have looked at, but those were the things that we tried. Yeah.
There's a wealth of literature now being generated, particularly out of the resilience studies and work being done with the U.S. Army that you're probably familiar with. It's now 4-year longitudinal data where there is no sample size. Everyone in the Army for 4 years now, they've been measured on a range of the psychosocial socio factors. And early headlines are some people develop in the exact same situation are more prone to develop PTSD. Others re-enlist, almost like in getting the post-traumatic growth. What did they bring with them in there and cause that, and what sort of training can mediate that, and that's all ongoing. So people more interested in going in post-traumatic growth and some of the literature, it's there. You had you were about to have a question.
Yeah, just 2 questions for Professor Proto, if you don't mind. One methodological, born of pure ignorance, and the other on a hypothesis that you advance, born of skepticism. So first, the methodological question. I wonder why you use this grab bag of hopefully neutral genes rather than mitochondrial DNA, which I understand is most commonly used for tracing genetic distances in physical anthropology. And the skeptical question is as to your hypothesis that small differences on the affective individual potentially caused by differences in the expression of HTT-LPR would be magnified through social networks rather than dampened by social networks. Just intuitively, it would seem to me that I could see how somebody, if I lived with somebody who was depressed, that would affect me, but the effect of that family member's depression would be dampened the farther you got from the center rather than magnified. And so if that intuition is right, I'm not sure how a minor shift in affect would be magnified through a social network so that you'd see dramatic differences from a relatively minor physiological effect.
First question, thanks a lot. I did not that measured. I can tell you I'm using this because economists now are using this. Yeah, could be nice, thanks. Do you know where I can find this data?
That's what physical anthropologists use to confirm, for example, the candelabra theory of human evolution, that we all come from East Africa by tracing out mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA isn't affected by evolutionary forces because you only get your mitochondrial DNA from your mother.
Is what is called this junk DNA by chance, or it has nothing to do?
It's not junk DNA.
No, okay, okay.
Without mitochondria, we'd all be dead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm telling you. It's
Yeah.
sorry.
So,
forgive me for my ignorance, but
yeah,
I'm
mitochondria
learning.
are basically bacteriological invaders in our cells that allow us to convert sucrose into energy. And so that's. But we get it from our mothers. It's not part of our genetic makeup. We get it from. It's donated to us from our mothers.
Maybe later we can give you some reference, perhaps. Social network. I can see. Maybe you read the paper. I don't know the old version of the paper. And in fact, this effect is actually too big. He's right. He's completely right. If people tend to find an effect which is about 8%, now it means anything and nothing, but a tiny effect, if any. Now this effect here, where is it? Here, seems to be too big, in fact. And our assumption is that, in fact, the presence of a depressed person into the household has a multiplying effect. And this effect on multiplication has been recently investigated by some happiness people, I think. Now, in this moment, the name doesn't come to my mind, but sorry, I forgot the name, but yeah, we can leave this effect. Now you are saying that social network, instead of having effect of magnifying bad state, it might smooth bad state, okay? This is the idea. I've done a little test myself. I took the British household panel and I checked how much the presence of a depressed person within the household, so controlling for family fixed effect, has an impact on the total happiness of the other members, the non-depressed members. Okay? So the year I control the year, I compare the year when in the household there are no depressed person and the year when in the household there is a depressed person. Okay? Only selecting the household where a depressed person has been there, at least for 1 year. And the effect is very high. So in the household, the effect of having a depressed person in the household is pretty high. Now, clearly doesn't mean that among the friends, among the network, this effect is not high, is high as well. It might be smoothing. But the problem is that recently economists tend to believe in a multiplicative effect. Say, hey, my dad is depressed, okay? So I'm going to my girlfriend and tell her, oh, my dad is depressed, I depress her. And she goes to her friend, she depresses her, and so on and so forth. So this is the multiplicative effect that happiness economists are investigating. I understand you don't like this argument.
My skepticism is born of raw intuition. You have data.
No, I have only data for household.
Okay,
But
we
not
have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to leave each of our panelists a couple of minutes at the end to do a summary statement or wrap up if you'd like. So until over the next few minutes, is there anyone who hasn't had the chance to offer an opinion, ask a question, or speak that I missed? Yes, please.
I had a question for Eugenio. I was just wondering, you mentioned that you talked about you compared things to HDI as one of the controls. I was wondering if you looked at economic inequality by country.
Yeah, that probably is a good idea. I haven't, yeah. There are data.
Or political stability or instability?
I thought about using indices of stability or even democracy, polity for indices. The fact is that these indices correlate very strongly with GDP. That's why I was not tremendously worried about that.
I know some of the research.
All of those new governments from Italy.
Yeah, that's probably the reason.
Some of the research you cited did control for, societal type issues like that, state of the welfare state, stability of government, rule of law, in the research that you based.
Yeah, that's definitely so. This is the fact that Denmark is there, in spite of the fact that it is a splendid and well-run country, despite of that, it's still a puzzle.
Right.
There is this dark matter, you see, it's a dark. Why they are so happy? That's basically why the world the universe doesn't. That's exactly the same. Why there is this dark happiness? Where does it come from?
Matt, did you?
Just a final question, or point really for Eugenio. This is great work and worth exploring. I think you say more in the paper, certainly in the presentation, but I would, in the paper at least, say even more about the differences at the high end of the scale as opposed to struggling. Because if what's going on is a depression gene, even if there is a kind of a social network multiplying effect, it's not very plausible that that would change the percentage of people, say, who are above 8 in the ladder, right? Or for that matter, the median, right? So if you see those differences being as pronounced as the differences in struggling, that would actually cast doubt on, this being caused by the differences in this depression gene, right? I think that really needs to be investigated.
No, what we did is this. We noticed that we checked also with average life satisfaction, as I said, but we did also another test. Okay, fine. I don't know what it is. We did another test by taking the World Value Survey, life satisfaction, and cutting it.
Right.
And we noticed that the cut works well when you cut at 8, 9, and 10. So in a sense, the people below 7 react very much to the genetic differences, which is quite high level of satisfaction.
So there's no difference say, between Italy and Denmark in terms of the proportion of people above 8, is that right?
No, it's not what I say. I say that this if you take if you build your own index, putting on one side people above 8 and the other 0 people below 8, this index react very much to genetic differences, is what I say. Now, that's what I do.
Right.
Is it fine?
In a way, it's kind of puzzling, because that suggests that I mean,
okay, but yeah.
I mean, absent a social network.
Okay, that's
right.
1 to 10 we cut at 8. We tried also. And actually, look, struggling between 5 and 7. And the future, the present, is built by a country future and country present, between 5 and 7, 5 and 8. Thriving are the people who are above 7, suffering are the people below 5. For all of them, you find an effect. Okay, for all these measures, you find pretty strong effect. Then we tried to do something similar with average life satisfaction. It works very well when you cut at 8.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure. So I guess you sort of need a theory as to whether the change in the percentage of this depression gene is just going to shift the whole distribution down, or do you have differential effects on differential parts of the distribution? So in a way, first I would need a theory of that, and then you could test that by looking at the correlation, correlation between distance and, struggling, as opposed to the correlation between distance and the percentage of people above 8 and so forth.
So
right?
we should look into how really the synthesis change
Exactly.
more deeply.
Yeah.
2 more questions. Walter, you had your hand up.
I just wanted to ask about the culture issues, because it looked like you looked at religion and language and a few other things, but this is totally intuition. I have no data. But it strikes me that, some cultures are just, they like to complain.
Yeah, like Italians, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, some people will say they're really not, I'm doing okay, no big deal. I mean, New Zealanders, you can't get them to say, like, oh, yeah, it's great. It's
Americans.
not in the culture.
Americans don't like to say that.
But Americans will. And so, I just wonder, is there any correction for that? Because it could just be that the Danish, they're not really happier. They just say they're happier.
You know what,
And this is a general problem for the whole field.
Clearly, clearly it's a cultural problem. The fact that you have a language, then this is a problem you can never control very much. But what people not normally control with these things is like region, pulling together Danes and Swedes, which are more or less similar, and still there is an element of an explanation. But these things, I think, is captured by that. You see, individualism is extremely positively correlated with happiness. Now, probably it's not correlated with happiness, but it's correlated with the feeling of reporting happiness. The more individualistic you are, the more you like to say that you are happy. Okay, this is a correlation which is true in the data. So my feeling is that the effect you are talking about is captured by Ofsted indices of culture. Okay, that's my feeling. That's my only answer at this. Probably I need more, but it's difficult to understand. How can you?
None of these are statistically significant.
No, in terms of this, but also because here there is hell of control, so I would be surprised if
you've got degree of freedom.
Spend a lot of time on that. Issues with that. But I saw one more question, then we'll have a closing statement, and then we can go out the back in the hall and carry on the dialogue.
So it's for Sandy. I want to return to this question of policy implications.
Yeah.
So yours is a micro study in many respects, as opposed to some of the other papers, including Eugenio's, which is very macro. Wouldn't there at least perhaps be some signals here that might be relevant, say, for a community health organization that's thinking about where to put its scarce dollars. That there's certain traumas that seem like they have particularly robust impacts.
Yeah.
Maybe that would be worth a strategic focus.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's the health connection is the critical one, and that this does suggest that in some sense all traumas are not equal, which is not to dismiss the significance of some of them, but it is to say that if we know that an individual's been exposed to a particular type of trauma, then we can anticipate that this could have very devastating effects on their life outcomes in the future, and that, you know, if there are ways in which we can intervene to help them deal with the trauma, then that would be a valuable investment of resources.
And
Yeah.
perhaps even that is step before the general healthcare provider population in some communities,
Yeah.
maybe all communities might want to be more attuned to those particular traumas, trying to
Yeah.
figure out whether that might be part of what's going on.
And whether there could be some preventive measures, yeah, to preclude them occurring in the first place. Just two things I wanted to say, which is first, thank you all for these suggestions, because they're terrific. And that we know that we have to do something about the endogeneity issues that are involved. So we're in the process of trying to see if we can identify some instruments in the data set. But I also want to say thank you for the suggestion about not losing the data on the scaling factors and just go back and use the original scaling rather than compressing the scale. Yeah, so, good. Thanks.
Yeah, I wish to thank everybody. Everything was very useful, and you know, we go on our exploration, and we'll probably take on board many of your advice.
Thank you so much. Thank both of our panelists. Great job. Thank you for your vigorous participation. I think we're on break till 11.